Well, welcome back to my channel. This is my third try. I wanted to just take a few minutes to thank everybody that has subscribed and to also welcome those of you who may be just seeing this for the first time. The premise of my channel is to, I'm not sure what the word is to use, but to basically speak about my life living with a disability and what things were like for me growing up. Kind of like an autobiography, but on video. So last week I spoke about Newington Children's Hospital. So this is going to be part two of that time there. As you might remember, I was there for like 2 years of my life. And so I wanted to just kind of like pick up where I left off. So I was going through some things with my mom, some remembrances that she had, and things that she actually reminded me of. And I was like, oh yeah, I forgot about that. But there was one other thing that I did realize what I had done when I reviewed the video. And that was that I had mentioned that I was going to tell y'all a funny story. And as I had mentioned last week, the hospital was out of this world. I mean, I think it was probably a one of a kind, at least for its time anyway. And the thing about Connecticut was that it had every aspect of a child's life in mind. Besides the surgical, they had a dental department, they had a recreation department that did things with kids, with the kids. And that, going back to that, I just wanted to also say, I had mentioned in the video last week that they would do things with the kids, like bring them down into the auditorium for concerts, because there was a massive auditorium there. But they would also bring us outside, which I did mention that last time. But the kids were brought out in every way, shape, and form. Whether you were in a bed, they would bring down beds. I was on a striker frame, so they would bring my striker frame down. Wheelchairs, walkers, crutches, braces, you name it, they did it. And those people were just fantastic. They were all volunteers. The second thing that I had mentioned that I was going to talk about was the funny story about the dental. And so because they dealt with the whole child, not just the surgical needs and the therapeutic needs and stuff. And so it was my turn to go to the dentist, and I was petrified of the dentist. And so I'm on the striker frame, and she's trying to get me to open my mouth, and I clamped shut. I would not open my mouth to save my life. No way. There was no way. They never did try that again with me, because I think they kind of knew that I wasn't going to be very compliant. But I just remember going like this, go, and they could not get in. So, oh gosh. Anyway, so yeah, so that was the one little kind of funny story that I had mentioned last week and then forgot all about it. I did again make some notes for myself. So if you see me referring, I'm probably going to even just pick it up, because I'm just sitting at my desk right now, because it's really the only place that I have to do. But let me just take a sip of my coffee. Oh, I also wanted to show you, we're decorated a little bit for the upcoming St. Patrick's Day. And so I got these little gnomes that I thought I would share with you. Dollar store, you gotta love it, right? Oh, wait, I'm sorry. It's not the dollar store anymore. It's the $1.25 dollar store. So anyway, yeah, I'm going to just take a sip of my coffee first. So I grew up in Maine, and I want to just first preface, I want to be very, very sensitive, in what I'm about to talk about. I want to make sure that it's understood that I'm actually really very sensitive where it comes to people that are quote unquote different. I'm different too in many ways, and yet I'm very much alike in a lot of ways. So I want to, like I said, I'm really struggling to share this story just because I don't want anyone to be offended or to take it wrong, or, but I guess I'll just have to just go and hope that you'll know my heart. I'm a 9-year-old little girl. Well, actually, probably 8.5 even. And my very first roommate was someone I will never, ever, ever forget. And I really often do wonder about her and where she is and how she grew up. Is she still with us and things like that? Because we had so much fun and we bonded, her and I, like we clicked right away. And but the story goes, according to what my mom told me, was that when they were bringing me to the room that I was going to be in, and of course I would get every once in a while get switched around rooms on one unit, and then as I got older, as I told you in a previous video, they had north and south, so I went from south and then to north, and so anyway, I saw a lot of different rooms in that hospital on just that one floor. But we were walking down the hallway, and as we entered the room, there was a little girl in the other bed, and she was going to be my little roommate. And my mother said that her first thought was, "Oh my word, what is she going to say?" Because this little girl was black, and I, in Maine at the time, we very rarely, if ever, we don't even remember having ever seen a black person before. And of course I had black nurses, and that was different for me, and I'd never really been exposed to it, never understood, never was told about it. It just wasn't a thing, that was talked about. So, and if it's not in your sphere, then you don't talk about it, right? And so my mom was very worried because they had never prepared me for that, for encountering people of different ethnic backgrounds. And she was wondering, what was I going to say anything? That was the thing she was the most worried about, was I going to say something, kind of like rude or whatever. And, you know, it didn't. And it wasn't until later years that I developed, as I learned more about like Black history, and learned about slavery in school, and those things, that I had developed who I am today. And so as I feel about other people of ethnic groups, and it seems to me that pretty much a lot of ethnic groups had a lot of difficulties and trials, particularly the black people that were in slavery, and then the civil rights movement. And then in high school, I learned all about Martin Luther King Jr., whom if I had to make a list of people that I admire, or that I would consider my heroes, Martin Luther King Jr. would be right at the top. And I was so touched and so moved by his "I Have a Dream." It really meant something to me, especially particularly that line in which he says that he dreams of a day when his children will be judged by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. And that is so totally true. I have often in my own life have felt that people just take one look at me and they limit me. And even if it's limiting, even in their own mind, well, they just presume that I can't do something, until they see it for themselves. And then their tunes change a bit. They start to realize that, the chair doesn't limit me. Limit is in your mind. With, of course, being realistic about what I can't do. There are some things that are just impossible, but there's a lot of things that people think I can't do, and they judge me based on that, and they think just from looking at me that, well, I can't do that. Well, it might not be the same thing. Oftentimes Black people are marginalized, I feel. Um, every Black man that walks past you is a bank robber, or worse yet, whatever. There's something bad, And they're not all. And guess what? Revelation people, there are white people that do the very same crimes that some black people have been accused of doing. So you can't say that it's a color thing, you know. So anyway, I got to get off my high horse because I know that if I keep going with this subject, I'm just going to get really tangled up. But as I said, it was a good learning experience. Like I said, the little girl and I, we clicked, and the nurses that I had were some of the most wonderful, wonderful nurses. In fact, I would very much easily say that there were some nurses that were white that were actually worse than the nurses that were of color. They were much more compassionate, and I think it's because they probably experienced some unkindness based on their color. And so they had a sense of compassion that was much to a much greater degree, you know. And so, yeah, I had a couple of nurses that weren't so kind. Um, I'll give you just one example. There was a new nurse that was on the floor, and I was on the striker frame at the time with the screws that I mentioned last week, here and here, with the halo around my head, and the screws on either side of the knees with my legs in casts. Now, as I told you last week, I had to be flipped every 2 hours so that I wouldn't develop pressure sores. And by the way, before I forget, I was also on a 2,000 calorie diet, and another funny story is coming. So just keep that one in mind. So anyway, she came in. She was new. I had never seen her before. I was probably 6 months on the striker frame at that point, or maybe a little less than that even. But at that point, I was used to being on it and used to being flipped, and wasn't having those dizzy spells like I did early on when I was on it. And she came in and she proceeded to put the straps on me because they had to belt me in 3 different places. I think it went from like here to midsection and then around my legs to keep me strapped in before they put the other piece on top and then turned, they put the piece on top first, excuse me. They put that piece on top first, the other part of the frame on the top of me, and then they would belt me in. And she proceeded to turn me, to start the process of turning me. And I said to her, "You're not supposed to turn me without somebody else there." And for whatever reason, she, to this day, I still can't figure it out. She got really cross with me. I guess she didn't like being corrected, which I wasn't meaning to correct her. I was just confused as to why that she was going to turn me on her own, and I knew that she wasn't supposed to do that. And she basically just told me, "Oh yeah, watch me." And then belted me in, sandwiched, and then flipped me. It was the most horrifying feeling I had ever had, because you could sense the person at the head and then the person at the foot as they both turned. So my, from like my torso up felt really insecure, and I could feel her hands at my feet just from the motion. And so, yeah, that wasn't so pleasant. I did end up telling one of the other nurses, and then after that, I found out later, probably either maybe years later, that she had ended up getting fired for having done that, which I felt bad that she got fired, but, she knew the rules and she disobeyed the rules. She chose to not go with it. So she lost her job for that. But otherwise than that, I would say that I had wonderful doctors and nurses that treated me with dignity, with respect. They treated me like the child that I was, and allayed fears when I had fears, and so on and so forth. They treated us like we were their own, really. So a few mentionables would be, I'm going to take my notes here, and some nurses that I had were Mrs. Williams. She was one of the black nurses that I had. And I remember seeing her. I had to be admitted when I was like 16 or 17 for something. I think it was for my braces to be adjusted, and because every so often they had to do that. So mom and dad would have to bring me to Connecticut to be admitted and go through that whole process of making a mold, and then you had to wait for so long. I think it was like a week or two, and I hadn't seen her in like what felt like a million years. And she walked into the room, and she wasn't my nurse for that night, and I was hoping that she was. But when she walked into the room, I said, "Oh, Mrs. Williams." She said, "You remember me?" Because I hadn't seen her since I was a kid, And last I saw her, I was 10, and I was going home at that time. I was going home uh, back to Maine, and so they, all the nurses would all like get together, and they would do like a little going away kind of thing and send you off when the kids left. And she was one of the last persons I hugged before we walked down the hall to go to the elevator. So when I came that time, to have the braces readjusted, she was just so shocked that I remembered. I said, "How could I forget you? You were my favorite." And there was Miss Tykeson. She was kind of like, she was a mama. She was a single lady, had no kids of her own, but she had like that instinct, that mama instinct in her. She was so sweet. And my mother says that she remembers Mrs. Brown. I'm kind of vague on that. If I saw a picture of her, though, I think that I would. And then the very first nurse that I had her name was Donna, and she was the first one that took care of me after I had my spinal fusion and I was placed on the striker frame. And then, of course, there's always a debt of gratitude towards Mrs. Emerson, who was the social worker who helped my mom and dad to navigate the whole Medicaid, Medicare system, because the state of Maine paid for me to be there to go out of state because of my situation. And so, Mom and I were talking about her, and we were saying, I wonder if she's even still alive, but she was a great help. And we saw her every time that we went. I would go after I did leave Connecticut. We would go every 6 months. And so it was almost kind of like going home. Again, it was like home away from home. And I would really look forward to going up to the floor that I was on to visit all the nurses. And that was like the highlight of my time, because the rest of the other time of those clinic visits were not, because it usually meant having to have all kinds of tests. And one of the tests that they would do periodically was one in which they did a dye through intravenous, and it would make me feel really flush and dizzy and hot and cold all at the same time. And I hated it. And my veins were so small, and I have rolling veins, so they get away, and it hurts. And so I would go into like a panic. I would literally break out in a sweat and start crying. The very last time they did that test, they did allow my mom to stay with me till the IV was finished, and then she had to leave because they were going to be running for the X-rays and everything. I think that one was to X-ray the bladder and the kidneys, but I'm not positive. And then of course I have to mention Mrs. Zimmerman. She was my physical therapy. And she, I owe a lot to her for teaching me how to be really independent, or as independent as I possibly can be. She also believed that she could get me to walk, and I did walk. But I walked for like maybe 8 years on crutches and braces. But because I was integrated into regular school, kids run in the halls to go from class to class. And they weren't, no offense to my classmates, but a lot of them were not very nice. They would run around me, and I was already scared enough as it was. I was never very proficient at walking. I saw a lot of kids that really, were really good at walking. It was like second nature to them with the crutches and braces. And I never got to that place. And I was petrified of water. So if, one of the kids stopped at the water fountain and sprayed it all over the floor, well, that was the end of me. But Mrs. Zimmerman really stretched me, and made me face a lot of fears. So one of the things that Mrs. Zimmerman would do would bring me to the mat. There was a mat on the floor, and I would stand in front of it, and we would practice falling, because there was a right way to fall and there was a wrong way to fall. And so we would practice falling, and so she would start out by giving me a warning that she was going to push me, and then the last few times she wouldn't. She would get me all into a conversation about something, and I'd be deep in conversation with her about something, and then all of a sudden she'd give me a good push, and down I would go, and I would have to remember how to brace. And so, and she was also the one that drilled it in my head that if I dropped something and there was nobody around to help, how are you going to do? What are you going to do? How are you going to pick it up? So we had to, learn how to do these things. Getting dressed was something else that she worked with me on. Toileting by myself, things like that. So I really appreciate her for having done that. And even though I was not successful with the walking, I did it up until I was 18. And most of the time I just used my crutches and braces to stand up somewhere, because it was kind of convenient to be able to stand up in a certain particular position that made it easier for me to get to something than it was to try to struggle to reach from the wheelchair. And so, and then one day I remember I was 18 years old. I think I already mentioned that, so sorry about being repetitive. I got up one morning and was getting dressed, and I put my braces on and got them all buckled up. These braces were unbelievable. They formed around my foot so that I could put regular shoes on, but then there was all these straps and buckles and belts, and it went up to my waist, and that had a strap as well. And there was locks on the hips and on the knees, so that I could unlock the knee to bend the knee, and so on. And same with the hip. In order to remain standing upright, I had to make sure that my hips were locked. And I remember getting up onto the floor off the bed. I was in the braces already, and I couldn't straighten out. So what ended up happening was my right leg had atrophied in the hip. I think it's as far as it's going to go now, but it's atrophied from being in the sitting position a lot. And because I definitely could not use crutches and braces at school. I had to be like everybody else and get from class to class all the time. And the quickest way to do it was to just be in the chair, So I couldn't straighten up. I could not make myself get up. And I said, Mom, my mom was in the kitchen, and I yelled to her, I says, I cannot straighten out. So she came into the bedroom, and she was watching me try to pull myself straight up, standing, and it wasn't happening. She says, well, just take them off. And of course that was cause to go for another visit to Connecticut, and the doctor said to my parents and myself, that there was an option, and the option was surgery, but we were looking at months of recuperation, and that meant probably months there. And so he asked me, was it easier for me to use the chair in school, or did I want to continue walking? And I said no. It was just so much easier for me in the chair in everyday life. It has its pros and its cons, I will tell you, because I do kind of miss standing up on my own 2 feet for certain things that would make it convenient for me, but it is what it is, right? So visitors, that was the other thing. Mom and Dad during that 2 years time would bring people to visit me, my friend Debbie and some of my cousins and things like that. But in the between time when my parents couldn't come, they couldn't come any more than every other week. And so my Aunt Zill and my Uncle Pat, who only lived 20 minutes away from the hospital, my mouth is getting dry, so I'm going to take a little sip here. And they would come in their stead to visit. And they would come about, every two or three times a week. And Uncle Pat would come, and sometimes he would bring one of his buddies from, I think it was his bowling league or something. And I just shut off my power chair, and he would sneak in things like stuff I wasn't supposed to have because, as I mentioned earlier in the video, I was on a 2,000 calorie diet, and so because they didn't want me to gain too much weight while I was in the striker frame, and including once I got into the body cast. And the body cast would come almost a year after that, and then it was which I'll probably get into because this video is getting kind of long, but I'll get into that. But that was to protect my back, but also to get me back into sitting up again, and that was weird. That was a very weird feeling, being able to sit up for the first time in almost a year. But Uncle Pat would sneak in things like donuts, candy, coffee, hence my problem with coffee. And of course, the coffee was mostly milk, and a little bit of sugar. And I don't think that we had back in the 70s, I don't think they had like sugar substitutes back then. I'm not sure. But it was pure sugar anyway. Sugar I wasn't supposed to have. And he got caught a couple of times. And then so sometimes he would say to me, I brought you a little snack. And he'd say, hurry up before the nurse comes in. And the nurses caught on to him, though. So they'd come in and see what I had. And then there was the time, remember I had told you that we had church on the different floors between, I think, the 6th and the 5th floor. So the Protestants were on the 5th floor and the Catholics were on my floor, the 6th floor or something like that. And one particular mass that we went to, Mom and Dad were there visiting. It was their weekend to visit. And Aunt Zill and Uncle Pat came, and I think their son John, my cousin John, and Francine were there. I don't know if it was some kind of a special occasion or what it was. I don't remember. But my Uncle Pat did something. And I tell the story and I laugh every time. And he made me laugh. And I couldn't stop laughing. And I laughed and I'd try to stifle it. And I'd laugh and I'd try to stifle it. And he kept doing whatever it was, face he was making, I don't know. And I kept laughing. Well, finally, I couldn't hold it in anymore. And I just let out this biggest laugh. And it was getting some of the other congregants laughing. It was upsetting the priest. And so they finally had to roll me out of the service. I don't even think we got communion. Oh my gosh, my aunt was so mad. My Aunt Zill was so mad. My mother, well, I'm not sure if my mom was or not, but I think she was too busy laughing, as was my father. Because every time that I start to giggle, my mother starts to giggle. And if I hear her giggle, I start giggling. The next thing you know, we're laughing uncontrollably. We have been that way ever since, I don't know, day one. So yeah, so that was the other thing was, yeah, I learned don't take Uncle Pat to church with you. So what followed after that, though, was not so pleasant. That night, late at night, I mean, I'm already asleep, because for us kids, 9 o'clock, lights out, and TVs went off. They had a switchboard where after a certain time, lights were out, and so did the TVs. So, and it's in the middle of the night, and in walks one of the nurses with the priest. Mind you, I had not made my first confession yet, because I was born and raised Catholic. I had not had that opportunity to do that. I didn't know what that was about. And so the priest comes in, and I don't remember a thing he said. I don't remember anything of what he said. But I do remember how it made me feel. Because I didn't feel like I had done anything that wrong to have been chastised like that. But apparently he did. And he did a very, very good job of making me feel that big to the point that I cried. And I cried and I cried. And I don't think that, if I remember right, I think the nurse was not very appreciative of it. She had to stay with me for a little while afterwards to calm me down. But I think it was like the next day or the next visit that my parents came, I told them about it. And my mother was not very happy because she felt the same way. What I had done was not a sin. And besides that, it was Uncle Pat's fault anyway. I love you, Uncle Pat, and I hope you rest in peace. But hey, he was funny. Who could fault a kid at 9 years old for laughing at an uncle, right? Who's being funny. So, but those are some of the memories of Connecticut. If I think of anything else in another video, I'll probably do a short perhaps, or I'll mention it next week. But I thank you for joining me. And I hope that you will like and subscribe and click the notification bell and share this video with anybody that you think may enjoy it. And also, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to make any comments down below. You have a wonderful evening. God bless you. Good night now. Bye. Mwah.